Welcome, sixth graders. We are going to get started today, continuing on actually getting finished with Hatchet. So our objectives are, I can identify ways that Brian's attitude changes throughout Hatchet, and I can explain the reasons why Brian has changed. So we are going to be taking a look at Brian's attitude. Go ahead and underline that. And then also how it changes. Underline that. And then the other key word here, the other key word here is why. So we're going to take a look at why he has changed. He's gone through some big changes, right, since we first met him. I'm going to go ahead and read this list of words. When I read a word that you think describes Brian, you are going to go ahead and put a star next to it. Do not put a circle around it. Make sure you put a star. Sad, disappointed, bitter, angry, apathetic. That means you don't really care about something. Joyful, frightened, hopeless, agitated. That's like you're aggravated at something. Apologetic, frustrated, annoyed, relieved, independent, unappreciative. So pause right there. Star next to any words that you think describe Brian. Confident, gloomy, courageous, powerful, talented, moody, lucky, faithful, determined, selfish, worried, polite, hardworking, childish, or alert. Alert kind of means you're always looking for things, you're aware and ready, you know what's around you. Star next to any words that remind you of Brian. Perfect. So where we had left off, we know that he is still in the woods. He has found some turtle eggs to eat and keep him hungry, or to keep him from being too hungry. He has built himself a little shelter and has a fire. Let's keep reading. He transferred all the eggs from the small beach into the shelter that he built himself. It took all his effort to keep from eating another one as he moved them. When they were out of sight again, it was easier to resist them. He added wood to the fire and cleaned up the camp area. Brian started to realize that it was all a mental thing. Mental means inside of your head. He had gotten depressed thinking about how they hadn't found him yet. And when he was busy and had something to do, the depression seemed to leave. So he kept himself busy with things to do. Things to do. There were so many things to do. So what is the person versus self conflict that we see here? What is Brian's problem that we just read about? With the camp squared away, he brought in more wood. It would take a lot to keep the fire going. No such thing as too much wood. He worked all through the morning, breaking down dead limbs of trees and breaking or chopping them in smaller pieces, storing them inside his shelter. He stopped only once to take a drink from the lake. Things to do, things to do. Okay, so I read this and I know that Brian's biggest problem here is that he gets really depressed and upset when he starts thinking about how he's away from home. So let's read the next stop and jot. What actions does Brian take to resolve that conflict? So write that first part down. What actions does Brian take to resolve that conflict? And then next, what strategy does Paulson use to reveal that resolution? Pause and write that down. Okay, so what you should definitely make sure you have for this here, guys, is that what he's doing to resolve it is he's trying to keep busy. So make sure you restate to resolve his conflict. He is trying to keep busy and do things around the camp. So let's see, what strategy is Gary Paulson using to reveal that resolution? I read that and I know I have to go back and look for the moments where he tells me he's trying to keep busy and think, what strategy is that? All right, it says he's things to do, things to do, things to do, things to do, things to do. So I read that and I know that the strategy he's using is repetition. So Paulson uses the strategy of repetition to show me that Brian is resolving this conflict by keeping himself busy with things to do. Unpause when you have that down. Okay, and so we know that he's reacting to this. Actually, another strategy too, right? His character reactions, because that's how he's reacting to his conflict. And what does that tell us about Brian? So I read this and I know that Brian is responding to a huge problem by being active, trying to make sure he does something to solve it. So this tells us that he is blank. Go ahead and use your word bank of attitude words. This tells me that Brian is what? All right, once you have a word filled in, continue along. His leg was mostly back to normal from the porcupine incident, although he had a small pattern of holes, roughly star-shaped, where the quills had nailed him. He did notice in the reflection in the lake, however, that his body was changing. So I read this and I know that today, because we're tracking for character change, and this is a time where Paulson mentions a change in our character, I'm going to go ahead and annotate that. So underline that and annotate character change. He had never been fat, but he had been slightly heavy. Now his stomach caved in to the hunger, and the sun was cooking him every day, darkening his pale skin to a tan shade. Perhaps more than his body, though, was the change in his mind. Okay, so there's another change, and I'm going to annotate that because I see another change in Brian. I am not the same, he thought. I see and I hear things differently than I did in the city. This environment changed me, being out in the wilderness all alone. Wow, and so I read that and I know that Paulson is showing me a change in this character through the strategy of inner dialogue. I am not the same, he thought. This environment changed me. I'm getting Brian's conversation with himself in his head, and this teaches me about his change. 6. Now when he heard a strange sound, he didn't just hear it, but he would truly listen and respond. He would swing and look at it, a breaking twig, a movement of air, and know the sound as if he somehow could move his mind back down the wave of the sound to the source of it. He knew what the sound was before he even realized he heard it. And when he saw something, a bird moving a wing inside a bush or a ripple on the water, he would truly see that thing, not just notice it as he used to just notice things in the city. He would see all parts of it, truly see the whole wing, the feathers, see the color of the feathers, see the bush and the size and the shape and the color of its leaves. He would see the way the light moved with the ripples on the water and see that the wind made ripples and which way the wind had to blow to make the ripples move in that certain way. So when it's talking about ripples in the water, this is what it's talking about. If you can kind of picture a lake or a pool of water, this is probably our best picture of it. And you see how it moves. That's for a reason. That comes from the wind. And Brian is saying that he now notices these things in a way he didn't before. None of that used to be in Brian, and now it was a part of him, a changed part of him, a grown part of him. And the two things, his mind and his body, had come together as well. Had made a connection with each other that he didn't quite understand. When his ears heard a sound or his eyes saw a sight, his mind took control of his body. Without his thinking, he moved to face the sound or sight, moved to make ready for it, to deal with it. So I read this and I know this is another big change that Paulson is telling me. So annotate for character change, because the way that his body now reacts to what's going on in his mind is a big change that I read in Brian. So which character trait best describes this new and changed Brian? Out of all the ones you see up here, choose one and put it on that line. Okay, so now that you have done that, copy down a piece of evidence, of course, in quotation marks, that supports your answer. So look at whatever word you wrote right here and copy down a piece of evidence that shows me that that's what Brian is like. The lake lay before him, 20 or so feet below, and he had not seen it this way since he had come in with the plane. Remembering the crash, he had a moment of fear, a breath-tightening little rip of terror, but it passed and he was quickly caught up in the beauty of the scenery. It was so incredibly beautiful that it was almost unreal. Okay, sixth graders, fantastic job so far. If you have made it to this point in the video, what I want you to do is go back, make sure you have all of these stop and jots with a lot of detail, and go back and annotate for any other moments that you see character change. So I showed you a few. use the rest of your time at this station